In 1910, a German ethnologist named Leo Frobenius stood in a clearing in what is now Osun State, Nigeria, staring at a bronze head that had just been pulled from the earth. The head was a portrait of a ruler, serene, naturalistic, cast with a technical precision that European foundries of the same era would have struggled to match. Frobenius held it in his hands and confronted an impossibility. Here was a sculptural tradition with the refinement of Renaissance Italy, dug from the soil of West Africa, in a place his colleagues had assured him contained no civilizations capable of such work. So he did what the European Academy of his time almost always did when confronted with African genius. He refused to attribute it to Africans. He proposed instead that these bronzes were relics of a lost Atlantic civilization, perhaps Greek, perhaps Phoenician, perhaps the survivors of Atlantis itself, who had somehow washed up on the coast of Nigeria and taught the locals how to create masterpieces before vanishing without any other trace. The locals, of course, told him a different story. They said the heads were made by their own ancestors in their own city of Ile-Ife, which their oral traditions described as the cradle of humanity itself, the place where the gods descended and created the world. Frobenius dismissed this as myth. The bronzes went to European museums, labeled with question marks about their origin. The textbooks wrote the Yoruba into a tidy colonial framework, a large West African ethnic group, certainly, with some interesting folklore, but not a people whose story could fundamentally alter the map of human history. That framework survived for a century. It was also, as the genetics would eventually reveal, badly incomplete. Not slightly incomplete, structurally wrong. Because buried in the DNA of today's Yoruba people, in the genomes of some 40 million individuals living across Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and diasporas stretching to Brazil and Cuba and the United States, was a piece of the human story that no fossil had ever been found for, that no excavation had ever uncovered, that no colonial scholar had ever imagined possible. A ghost population, an archaic human lineage that split from our own ancestors 500,000 to 1 million years ago, that interbred with the ancestors of the Yoruba somewhere between 50,000 and 124,000 years ago, and that left up to 10% of its genome still circulating in the blood of an average Yoruba person alive right now, walking through Lagos or Ibadan, or a diaspora neighborhood in Salvador or Miami, carrying inside their cells the code of a being no one has ever seen and no museum has ever displayed. Sit with that number, 10%, 1/10 of a person's genetic identity, coming from a branch of humanity that science did not know existed until statistical models pried it out of the genome a few years ago. This is not Neanderthal DNA. Europeans and Asians carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal. This is not Denisovan DNA. Some Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry up to 5% Denisovan. This is something entirely other. An archaic African population so old, so deeply diverged from the modern human lineage, that it may represent one of the earliest splits in the history of our genus. And no one has ever dug up its bones. The textbooks call the Yoruba a subgroup of the Niger-Congo language family, a people who settled in the forests and savannas of what is now southwestern Nigeria, who built city-states, who organized elaborate kingdoms, who contributed mightily to the cultural fabric of West Africa. That's the old story. It sounds clean. It sounds complete. But real history almost never behaves like a tidy paragraph. The old story of the Yoruba, the version you might still find in a dated encyclopedia or a broad introductory text, goes something like this. They are one of the 3 largest ethnic groups in Nigeria, alongside the Hausa Fulani in the north and the Igbo in the southeast. Their language belongs to the Yoruboid cluster within the larger Niger-Congo family, related to the languages of the Itsekiri and Igala peoples. They emerged as a recognizable cultural entity perhaps 1,000 years ago, coalescing around the sacred city of Ile-Ife, which oral tradition holds to be the site where the high god Olodumare sent the Orisha Obatala to create dry land and sculpt the first human beings from clay. From Ile-Ife, according to both tradition and archaeological evidence, Yoruba political organization radiated outward, establishing kingdoms like Oyo, which became one of the most powerful states in West Africa by the 17th and 18th centuries, commanding cavalry armies and trading networks that reached the coast and the Sahara. The Yoruba were agriculturalists, craftspeople, traders. They developed a complex urban civilization when much of Europe was still fumbling through the early medieval period. Their bronze and terracotta sculptures, produced by the lost wax casting method, represent one of the world's great artistic traditions. Under colonial rule, the Yoruba were categorized, administered, and partially incorporated into the British educational system, producing a literate elite that would eventually include figures like Wole Soyinka, the first African Nobel laureate in literature. In the transatlantic slave trade, Yoruba-speaking captives were fed into the ships at Lagos and Badagry and Wida in enormous numbers, particularly during the collapse of the Oyo Empire in the early 19th century, when internal warfare generated waves of prisoners sold to European traders. These captives carried their language, their religion, their Orisha worship, their Ifa divination system, and their drumming traditions to the Americas, where they became foundational to Afro-Brazilian candomblé, to Cuban Santeria, to Trinidadian Shango worship, to Haitian Vodou. In the genetic ancestry of today's African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, and Afro-Cubans, the Yoruba footprint is deep, often the single largest African contributing population. That is the summary. It is not wrong. It is just a surface map drawn by people who assumed the story began when written records and monumental archaeology became visible, and who had no way of knowing that underneath that surface map lay a subterranean continent of genetic history that was older, stranger, and more revelatory than anything visible above ground. The first crack in that surface map came not from Nigeria, but from the larger picture of African genetic diversity that scientists began to assemble in the early 21st century. In 2015, the 1000 Genomes Project, an international consortium publishing in the journal Nature, established something that quietly rearranged the foundations of human genetics. The project had been sequencing thousands of genomes from populations around the globe, building a reference catalog of human genetic variation. When they needed a reference population to represent Africa, they chose the Yoruba. 108 unrelated Yoruba individuals from Ibadan, Nigeria, became the YRI panel, the yardstick against which African genetic diversity would be measured for years to come. The choice was not arbitrary. The Yoruba genome turned out to be one of the most informative in the world, because it contained a density of genetic variation that made every other population on Earth look genetically impoverished by comparison. African genetic diversity is greater than in all other human populations combined. This is a statement that scientists have repeated now for 2 decades, and it still lands with insufficient force. Let that sink in. All the genetic diversity you see across Europe, across Asia, across the Americas, across the Pacific Islands, all the variation in skin color and hair texture and disease resistance and metabolic pathway and stature and facial morphology that distinguishes a Norwegian from a Japanese, from a Quechua, from a Samoan, if you added all of it together, it would still represent a smaller total range of genetic variation than what exists within Africa alone. And within Africa, the Yoruba genome is one of the deepest wells. The reason is time. Modern humans originated in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago and spent the vast majority of our species' history there. The migrations out of Africa that eventually populated the rest of the planet, the ancestors of all non-Africans, were small founder events, genetic bottlenecks that carried only a fraction of the total human genetic diversity out with them. The bulk of our species' variation stayed behind, accumulating layer upon layer across hundreds of thousands of years, in the populations that never left. The Yoruba are one of those populations. Their genome is not a snapshot of a recent event. It is a palimpsest, a deeply inscribed document with layers of writing from different eras of human prehistory, some of them so old that the ink is barely legible even to the most sophisticated statistical tools. But by 2017, those tools had advanced enough to start reading the oldest layers. And what they read changed everything. In 2017, a team led by Pontus Skoglund published in the journal Cell a study titled Reconstructing Prehistoric African Population Structure. They had sequenced 16 ancient African genomes, drawn from archaeological sites in Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa, spanning roughly the last 8,000 years. These ancient genomes gave them physical anchors in time, actual bones, actual DNA from people who lived millennia ago. By comparing these ancient genomes to modern African populations, including the Yoruba, they could begin to model the deep population structure of the continent. What emerged was a branching tree of extraordinary depth. The ancestors of today's West Africans, including the Yoruba, represented a lineage that had split from other African lineages very early, roughly 200,000 years ago or more. This was not a recent separation. It was a divergence that happened when our species was still young, when Homo sapiens was still confined to Africa, when the technologies we associate with behavioral modernity, complex tools, symbolic art, long-distance trade, were only beginning to flicker into existence. The Yoruba lineage had been following its own evolutionary path, accumulating its own unique mutations, adapting to its own specific environments in West Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. They were not an offshoot of some larger, more central African population. They were a trunk branch of the human family tree in their own right. Read that again. A trunk branch, not a twig, not a recent derivation, one of the deepest, oldest, most continuously distinct human lineages on the planet. And that was only the beginning of what the genome was about to reveal. Because the Skoglund study established deep continuity, it confirmed that the Yoruba were ancient in place. But it didn't answer a question that was beginning to nag at population geneticists who worked on African genomes. When they ran their models, the numbers didn't quite close. The patterns of genetic variation in West African populations, including the Yoruba, contained anomalies, segments of DNA that didn't seem to fit any known modern human lineage, sequences that looked too divergent, too old, as if they had been borrowed from a source that was not quite Homo sapiens. European and Asian genomes had shown similar anomalies a decade earlier, and those anomalies had resolved into the now famous discoveries of Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture. Non-Africans carry the genetic echoes of ancient encounters with other human species, encounters that happened after their ancestors left Africa, when they moved into Eurasia and met the archaic populations already living there. But Africans were supposed to be the pure source population, the original stock from which all others derived. If non-Africans carried archaic admixture from Neanderthals and Denisovans, Africans, according to the simple model, should not carry any. That model was wrong. The genome had one more secret waiting, and it was bigger than anyone expected. The landmark paper landed in 2020. Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman of WUCLA published in the journal Science Advances a study, with a title that read like the premise of a science fiction novel, Recovering Signals of Ghost Archaic Introgression in African Populations. The word ghost was not metaphorical. It was a technical term, becoming common in the field, for an archaic human population that has left genetic traces in modern genomes but has never been identified in the fossil record. No skull, no jawbone, no femur, no tooth, no archaeological site bearing its name. A population known only by the statistical shadows it casts in the DNA of the living. The researchers had developed a computational method to scan modern genomes for segments of DNA that look too ancient, too divergent, to have come from the main Homo sapiens lineage. They applied it to 4 West African populations: the Yoruba from Nigeria, the Mende from Sierra Leone, the Esan, also from Nigeria, and the Gambian Mandinka. In every single population, they found the signal. In the Yoruba, they estimated that between roughly 2% and 19% of the genome derived from this unknown archaic source, with a central estimate clustering around 8 to 10%, depending on the specific statistical model and the specific population sample. The ghost lineage, whatever it was, had split from the ancestors of modern humans somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million years ago. That is a staggering depth of time. To put it in context, the Neanderthal lineage split from the modern human lineage roughly 500,000 to 700,000 years ago. This ghost African archaic population was potentially older than the Neanderthal divergence, possibly much older, representing one of the earliest branchings in the entire human family tree. And then, after hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution, it had come back into contact with the ancestors of modern West Africans. The admixture event, the interbreeding, happened roughly 50,000 to 124,000 years ago. Enormous uncertainty brackets that date, because the statistical models are straining against the limits of what DNA preserved in living people can tell us about events so deep in time. But the central fact was not in doubt. Modern West Africans, and the Yoruba among them, carry within their genomes the living legacy of a human species that otherwise vanished without a trace detectable by any other means. No fossil, no artifact, only the invisible code written into the cells of 40 million people. The following year, in 2019, a separate team led by Jeffrey Wall at the University of California, San Francisco, published in the journal Genome Biology an independent confirmation. Their study, titled Archaic Admixture in a Modern West African Population, examined the Mende and Yoruba genomes with a different analytical approach and arrived at essentially the same conclusion. They estimated that roughly 7.9% of the Mende genome derived from an archaic source, and roughly 8 to 10% for the Yoruba. Two independent teams, two independent methods, the same ghost staring back from the data. This is not a weakness in science. It is science being honest about what it can and cannot claim. The fossil has not been found. It may never be found. The acidic soils of West Africa are notoriously hostile to bone preservation, and the humid tropical climate degrades organic material over timescales that make fossil recovery exceptionally difficult. The ghost may be permanently invisible to archaeology, recoverable only through the statistical interrogation of the living. Scientists are careful to attach error bars to these estimates. The percentage could be as low as 2% or as high as 19%, depending on the assumptions baked into the model. The exact split time, the exact admixture date, the geographic location of the encounter, all of these remain open debates, with multiple plausible scenarios and insufficient data to choose decisively among them. But the existence of the ghost itself is now one of the most robust findings in African population genetics. Something archaic contributed to the Yoruba genome. Something non-human, in the sense of not belonging to the main Homo sapiens lineage as we narrowly define it, but clearly a close cousin, close enough to produce fertile offspring, close enough that its DNA is still present, still functional, still shaping biology in measurable ways, more than 50,000 years after the last pure representatives of its kind walked the earth. If everything so far surprised you, the next finding turns the whole thing over. Because the ghost archaic is not just an abstract statistical curiosity. It has biological consequences that reach into the lives of Yoruba people today, shaping disease resistance, shaping blood biology, shaping the very capacity to survive in a landscape that has been trying to kill humans with malaria for thousands of years. And here's where the story turns from deep prehistory into the lived reality of the present. Let's break this open. To understand what the ghost archaic actually means, you have to understand the environment that shaped the Yoruba genome over all those hundreds of thousands of years. West Africa is one of the most pathogenically hostile environments on the planet for humans. Malaria, in particular, has been a relentless selective pressure. The Plasmodium falciparum parasite, transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes, has killed more human beings than probably any other single infectious agent in history, and it is hyper-endemic across the Yoruba homeland. When a selective pressure is that intense and that consistent, it leaves scars on the genome, or more precisely, it leaves signatures of adaptation, places where natural selection has favored genetic variants that offer some protection, even if those variants come with costs. The Yoruba genome carries one of the most dramatic examples of malaria-driven adaptation ever documented. It is called the Duffy null blood type, technically designated FY. B²S. In most human populations, the Duffy antigen is a protein that sits on the surface of red blood cells, and it serves as a receptor, a docking port, for Plasmodium vivax, one of the major malaria parasites. Without that receptor, P, vivax cannot enter the red blood cell and cannot establish infection. The Duffy null mutation silences the Duffy gene specifically in red blood cells, removing the receptor and providing near-complete resistance to vivax malaria. In the Yoruba, and in many West African populations, the frequency of this mutation is over 95%. 95%. Nearly every Yoruba person carries it. It is one of the most complete selective sweeps documented in any human population. And it has a history. Colonial medicine, encountering African populations that were mysteriously resistant to a malaria strain that devastated European colonists in other tropical regions, spent decades misinterpreting this finding, folding it into racialized theories of African biology that ranged from the patronizing to the outright pseudoscientific. The truth, as the genetics now makes clear, is that West African populations evolved this resistance the hard way, through countless generations of children dying of malaria, generation after generation, with those rare individuals who carried a Duffy mutation surviving to pass it on, until the mutation became the norm, the baseline, the assumed state of a Yoruba red blood cell. This is not a simple story of a population being blessed with a protective gene. It is a story of catastrophic mortality over evolutionary time, carving a genetic signature into a people. The ghost archaic may be part of this story. Some of the archaic DNA segments identified in Yoruba genomes are in regions associated with immune function, and researchers have hypothesized that archaic introgression may have contributed adaptive variants, borrowed immunity from a cousin lineage that had already been adapting to African pathogens for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans even encountered those pathogens. This hypothesis is not yet proven. It is an active area of investigation. But the logic is compelling. When the ancestors of the Yoruba encountered the ghost archaic population, they may have acquired more than just genetic curiosity value. They may have acquired survival tools, evolutionary shortcuts to adapt to a brutal disease environment that have been protecting their descendants ever since. The immune system story deepens when you zoom in on a different set of genes. In 2019, a study led by Fan and colleagues, published in Genome Biology, examined whole genome sequence data from 44 indigenous African populations. They were looking for signals of natural selection, and the Yoruba genome lit up in specific regions governing immune function. The malaria pressure was visible in multiple genetic pathways, not just Duffy. Variants in genes related to hemoglobin structure, to inflammatory response, to spleen function. All showed signatures of selection in West African populations generally, and in the Yoruba specifically. But the Fan study also found something else, something that speaks to the depth and distinctiveness of the Yoruba lineage. Even within the broad West African genetic cluster, which includes populations like the Mende, the Mandinka, the Isan, the Yoruba have their own specific genetic signatures, their own unique patterns of variation that mark them as a population with a long history of separate evolution within the region. They are not just one interchangeable tile in a West African mosaic. They are a deeply etched piece with its own contours, its own internal complexity, its own evolutionary narrative that does not fully overlap with even their closest geographic neighbors. If your family carries roots from the Yoruba, or from the broader West African populations that fed the diaspora, the specific mixture in your DNA right now reflects a history unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. A history that includes an archaic human species science didn't know existed. A history of thousands of generations of adaptation to one of the most challenging disease environments on the planet. A history written in genetic code that is older and stranger than the textbooks ever acknowledged. Now bring the earlier thread back, because it connects to everything you just heard. The Yoruba-Bantu question. For decades, the standard model of African population history grouped the Yoruba together with the broader family of Niger-Congo-speaking peoples that includes the vast Bantu expansion. The Bantu expansion began roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago from a homeland near the modern Cameroon-Nigeria border, and swept east and south across the continent, carrying agricultural technologies, ironworking, and Bantu languages to regions as far-flung as Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa. The traditional view held that the Yoruba were essentially related to this Bantu source population, part of the same West African genetic cluster that gave rise to the Great Migration. The genetic data has forced a revision. The Yoruba are genetically distinct from the East and Southern Bantu populations in measurable ways, representing a separate West African lineage with deep continuity in place. They are not the population that left, they are the population that stayed. The Bantu expansion drew from populations related to the Yoruba, populations in the same broad West African genetic neighborhood. But the Yoruba themselves represent a deeper branch, one that continued its own independent trajectory in the forests and savannas of what is now southwestern Nigeria, while related groups moved across half the continent. And the oral traditions, the ones that Leo Frobenius dismissed in 1910, turn out to be their own form of deep record. Yoruba oral tradition names Ile Ife as the cradle of humanity in their cosmology. The high god Olodumare sent the Orisha, Obatala, down from the heavens on a chain, carrying a snail shell filled with sand and a rooster, to create the first land on the primordial waters, and to sculpt the first human beings from clay. Ile Ife, in this tradition, is not just a city, it is the point of origin, the umbilicus of the world. Archaeology confirms that Ile Ife flourished as one of West Africa's most sophisticated urban civilizations, roughly between 1100 and 1400 CE. A medieval city-state with paved courtyards, monumental sculpture, complex political organization, and an artistic tradition that produced the bronze and terracotta heads that so astonished Frobenius. But the oral tradition insists that Ile Ife is older than its medieval archaeology. It insists that the Yoruba people have roots at that site that extend far deeper into time. The genetics does not directly validate the religious cosmology. Science cannot speak to whether a god lowered a chain from the sky. But it does validate something profound. The Yoruba are ancient in place. Their genetic lineage has been distinct and continuous in West Africa for timescales that dwarf the medieval period, that dwarf the Bantu expansion, that stretch back past the beginning of agriculture, past the invention of the bow and arrow, past the migration out of Africa, into an era when the very definition of what counted as human was more fluid than our textbooks have been willing to admit. The oral tradition's insistence on deep origins at Ile-Ife may not be literally true in every mythological detail, but it captures a historical reality that the colonial model completely missed. The Yoruba are not a recent ethnic formation. They are a trunk branch of the human family tree, and their sense of being a people of origin is grounded, however mythologically expressed, in a genetic reality that Western science has only just begun to uncover. Try to imagine standing in Ile-Ife 1,000 years ago. The city is at its height. Paved roads run between compounds. In the palace of the Uni, the sacred king, bronze casters are preparing a lost wax casting, a process that requires building a clay core, coating it in wax, sculpting the wax into the detailed features of a ruler's face, encasing the whole thing in an outer clay mold, heating it until the wax drains out, and pouring molten copper alloy into the void left behind. The technique is unforgiving. The mold must be vented precisely, or the metal will trap air and the casting will fail. The alloy must be mixed to the right proportions, or the metal will crack as it cools. The temperature must be controlled perfectly, or the surface will pit and scar. The Yoruba bronze casters of Ile-Ife mastered all of it, producing portrait heads with thin-walled hollow castings, with delicate facial modeling, with elaborate headdresses and scarification marks, that later metallurgists and art historians would rank among the finest bronze castings ever produced anywhere in the world. Frobenius, in 1910, could not fit these objects into his mental model of Africa. His mental model was the Hamitic hypothesis, the idea, dominant in European scholarship well into the 20th century, that any African cultural achievement must have been imported by lighter-skinned, Caucasoid, Middle Eastern or European civilizers. The hypothesis was not a fringe theory. It was mainstream anthropology. It was taught in universities. It was cited in colonial policy documents. It was used to justify the denial of African history, the dismissal of African oral traditions, the erasure of African civilizations from the global narrative of human achievement. The Hamitic hypothesis was wrong. It was not slightly incomplete. It was structurally wrong. And the DNA has now demonstrated, at a molecular level, exactly how wrong it was. The deepest human lineages on Earth trace to Africa. The oldest ancestry in the human species today is African. The most genetically distinctive populations on the planet are African, and the Yoruba genome is one of the clearest windows into that depth. They carry an archaic human legacy that exists nowhere else. They represent a continuous lineage that split from other human populations 200,000 years ago. Their ancestors were building sophisticated urban civilizations in West Africa, while the Hamitic hypothesis imagined civilizers were still living in mud huts in a Europe that had yet to produce anything comparable in metallurgical sophistication. Read that again. Picture the moment Frobenius held that bronze head. He was holding the product of an unbroken cultural and genetic lineage that stretched back past the dawn of Homo sapiens, past the divergence of any non-African population, into an epoch when the hominin family tree was still branching and merging in ways we are only now beginning to understand. The ghost archaic was still alive then, somewhere in West Africa, perhaps in the same forests that would later shelter Ile-Ife. A human population that had been separate for 500,000 years or more was encountering the ancestors of the people whose descendants would cast that bronze head. They interbred, they exchanged genes, and then the ghost population vanished, leaving nothing behind but its genetic echo and, eventually, the artistic genius of a civilization that Frobenius could not bring himself to accept. If the story stopped here, it would already be powerful enough on its own. But ancient DNA had one more secret waiting, and it reaches beyond Africa, across the Atlantic, into the living rooms and family histories of millions of people who may have no idea they carry this story in their own cells. The transatlantic slave trade seized Yoruba speakers in massive numbers, particularly in its later phases. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, roughly 12 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. The ports of the Bight of Benin, Lagos, Badagry, Ouidah, were among the busiest embarkation points on the entire continent, and the collapse of the Oyo Empire in the early 19th century produced a catastrophic wave of internal warfare that fed captives into those ports by the tens of thousands. These captives were Yoruba. They carried with them their language, their kinship structures, their drumming traditions, their medicinal knowledge, and their religion. In Brazil, Yoruba-derived communities became known as Nago, and their religious tradition crystallized into candomblé, centered on the worship of the Orishas, Shango, the thunder god, Yemoja, the mother of waters, Ogun, the god of iron and war, Oshun, the river goddess of love and fertility and honey. In Cuba, the Yoruba became the Lukumi, and their religion became Santeria, the way of the saints, where the Orishas were syncretized with Catholic saints, but the underlying theology, the divination system of Ifa, the drumming rhythms, the spirit possession ceremonies, remained recognizably Yoruba. In Trinidad, Shango worship took root. In Haiti, the Yoruba contribution blended with Fon and Congo influences to help shape Vodou. In the United States, Yoruba captives arrived in significant numbers to Charleston, to Mobile, to New Orleans, and their genetic and cultural legacy diffused through the African American population as a whole. This is not marginal history. The Yoruba diaspora is one of the great demographic events of the modern era, and genetic studies have now quantified it. In 2017, Fortes Lima and colleagues published an analysis of African genetic ancestry in the Americas that found African Americans, on average, carry roughly 13 to 15% Yoruba-related ancestry. In some regions, particularly those with heavy historical importation from the Bight of Benin, the percentage is higher. In Afro-Brazilian populations, the Yoruba contribution can be the single largest African component. In Cuba, the Lukumi genetic signature is clearly identifiable in Afro-Cuban genomes. Millions of people in the Americas, many of whom may identify broadly as Black or African American or Afro-Latino without knowing the specific ethnic threads woven into their ancestry, carry within their genomes the same ghost archaic DNA, the same Duffy null mutation, the same deep West African lineage markers, the same genetic continuity that traces back through Ile-Ife and into that invisible Pleistocene encounter between Homo sapiens and a forgotten human species. If you carry roots from these communities, some version of this history is sitting in your genome right now. It's in your blood cells and your immune genes and your mitochondrial haplogroups. Your mtDNA, if you descend from a Yoruba maternal line, likely belongs to one of the L1, L2, or L3 haplogroups, the oldest branches of the human maternal tree, the lineages that trace back to the very emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, lineages that have never left the continent except in the bodies of women forced onto slave ships. L1, L2, L3. These letters and numbers are not abstract genetic jargon. They are the oldest continuous maternal genealogies on Earth, and they are disproportionately present in the cells of Black people in the Americas, whose ancestors survived the Middle Passage. This is not just about correcting a history book. It reaches into the identity of millions, into the biological inheritance of the African diaspora, into the living connection between Yoruba grandmothers in Ibadan and their genetic descendants walking through Brooklyn or Sao Paulo or Havana, carrying inside their cells the record of an African past older than any fossil in any museum. Leave one word in the comments capturing how this makes you feel. Just one word. The Yoruba were never who we thought, not because they turned out to be less than the textbooks claimed, because they turned out to be more, deeper, older, more central to the human story. The colonial model wanted them to be a regional ethnic group with some interesting art and a colorful mythology. The DNA says they are a trunk branch of Homo sapiens, a people whose ancestors were already genetically distinct when the ancestors of Europeans and Asians were still living in Africa themselves. A population that met and mixed with an archaic human species that has left no other trace on Earth. A civilization that produced technical wonders that European scholars literally could not believe Africans had made, and a diaspora whose genetic legacy now stretches across 2 continents and defines a significant fraction of the ancestry of the African-descended peoples of the Americas. The Yoruba oral tradition has it that Ile-Ife is the cradle of humanity. Science cannot confirm the mythology, but it can confirm something the mythology was always pointing toward. The Yoruba are not descendants of some lost civilization. They built one, and their DNA carries pieces of an African past older than any fossil in any museum, older than any written word, older than any city, older than the very categories we use to separate human from pre-human. The textbooks are still catching up. History is not finished. The ghost archaic has not been found. and it may never be found. Its bones may be dissolving in acidic forest soils somewhere in the West African interior, irretrievable. But it survived. It survived in the genome of the Yoruba, in the blood of their diaspora descendants, in the immune systems of people walking through the 21st century who have no idea they are carrying the last remnants of a human species that the fossil record may never acknowledge. Subscribe. We go this deep every time, past the comfortable version of the story and into what the DNA actually shows.